afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's most exciting and inspiring launch, featuring the book Unsilencing Slavery, telling the truths about Rose Hall Plantation, Jamaica, by Professor Celia E. Naylor. I am particularly happy that the weather has allowed us all to be here to share in Celia's wonderful accomplishment. Celia E. Naylor is a professor in the Africana Studies and History departments at Barnard College, Columbia University. Before joining the Barnard College faculty in 2010, she started as an assistant professor and was promoted to associate professor of history at Dartmouth College. Professor Naylor earned her BA in Africana Studies, summa cum laude, with a concentration in Women's Studies from Cornell University, an MA in Afro-American Studies from UCLA, and an MA and PhD in History from Duke University. At Barnard College, she teaches a number of courses, including Introduction to African American History, Introduction to Diaspora, Remembering Slavery, and others. Most of her published work explores the multifaceted connections between African Americans, Black Indians, and Native Americans in the U.S. She was one of the coordinators of the historic conference, Eating Out of the Same Pot, relating Black and Native histories, held at Dartmouth College in April 2000. Her book, entitled African Cherokees in Indian Territory, From Chattel to Citizens, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in May 2008. Her interests include African American and Caribbean history, Native American history, women's history and literature in the African diaspora, and colonialism and neo-colonialism in the Americas. Professor Naylor's current project centers on the Rose Hall Plantation in Montego Bay, Jamaica, which we will no doubt learn a lot about in this afternoon's presentation. Interesting to note is that the website for this project, Unsilencing Slavery, Remembering the Enslaved at Rose Hall Plantation, Jamaica, was launched on August 6th, 2022, in honor of the 60th anniversary of Jamaica's independence and as part of Jamaica's annual celebration of emancipendence. As a result of Professor Naylor's interest in and commitment to racial equity and social justice, she has been working with the Institute for Strategic and Equitable Development, ISED, and has served as president of the board of directors of this non-profit organization since its establishment in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend and Caribbean author par excellence, Miss Celia Naylor. Okay. Okay. Then, our wonderful moderator this afternoon is another good friend and past student of mine, the recently married Mrs. Shanique Kitson. So Shanique, also known as Shans, the book fairy, is no stranger to the arts and all that it encompasses. The international recording artist with a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of the West Indies, visited the passion for books through her new efforts as a host and book influencer. The Campion College and Mona School of Business graduate has, over the past 2 years, received so much attention for her stunning book photo aesthetics and detailed and beautifully expressed book reviews that she not only appeared in interviews in the Jamaica Gleaner and both TVJ and CVM, but has since served as a contributor to the Jamaica Gleaner, sharing her book reviews and recommendations. Shanique continues to exhibit her zest for her literary work in her bi-week Friday night series, Friday Night Bookish Lime, where she interviews authors and shares fun banter about books with attendees who are called the Fairy Gang. When she's not heavily engaged in her literary works, she can be found performing somewhere around the world, running her family-owned cultural exchange business, or pumping her efforts into her foundation with a focus on expanding the minds and safe spaces for young boys through literature. Isn't that good? That's excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Shanique Kitson. Before I turn over to Mrs. Kitson to run the show from here, we're going to have a short item, and I will ask Miss Michelle Edwards to join me. Oh, by the way, did I say? I don't know. I'm Karen Armstrong. Yes, I am Karen Armstrong. And so I'm a musician and a teacher at Campion College, so I taught Miss Shanique Kitson many. Okay. Just the other day. Okay. So we're going to do for you an arrangement of Redemption Song.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This song, Redemption Song, was specially arranged by Karen. And so it gives me pleasure to share it with you today. Yes, the rabbi sold her to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit, my hand was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation triumphantly. Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? It's all I ever have. Redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, for none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Ooh. Some say it's just a part of it. You have to fulfill the book. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We have to fulfill the book. Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption song, redemption song. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Ooh. Some say it's just a part of it. We have to fulfill the book. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs, redemption songs. Ooh, redemption songs.
I think we need to give another round of applause for that beautiful. Not only was the rendition beautiful, but the vocalist was flawless. It was very, very well produced and executed. Thank you guys so much. And before I start with the lovely Professor Celia Naylor, let me just say I am honored to be in your presence. And I am excited, elated to really get down into unsilencing this book and getting down into the meat of the matter. But I just wanted to say that I'm going to ask you to read to us an excerpt of the book, just so persons can have an idea of what the content is, what this material is that we're going to discuss today. But I think the song that was chosen is so fitting and so appropriate. Won't you help me sing this song of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have is my redemption song. And I think when we talk about unsilencing slavery, for me, freedom is reinstatement. It is creating a story and a context for the voiceless, which is basically what you've done here in this body of work. So we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about that. But I would love for you to start by just reading for us part of the book, so we can know what we are looking at in this body of work.
So thank you, Shanique, so much for doing this, and thanks to Karen Armstrong. We'll do a whole thing of gratitude at the end, but I just want to extend my appreciation for you, just the amazing creative that you are, and the fact that you choreographed this whole thing, and that lovely arrangement. And to Michelle over there, thank you so much for the beautiful rendition of that. So thank you, Shanique. It's one of the practices that I've started in my classes is to actually have a musical libation, what I call a musical libation, at the beginning of every class. And last week, Monday, this was actually the musical libation for the class. And part of the reason that I chose that is because at the very beginning, Marley starts with an invocation, right? And it's a invocation to the transatlantic slave trade. It's an invocation to the Middle Passage. It's an invocation to all of the generations, right, who lived through the Middle Passage, and those who did not survive it. It's also important to realize that some of the lyrics from that song about emancipate yourself from mental slavery actually come from a speech of Marcus Garvey from 1937 that he delivered in Nova Scotia in Canada. And so it's important to think about how Marley and many other musicians, right, often incorporate iconic figures and their speeches and their iconic words in so many ways. And this is just one example. In some ways, listening to it, I think of this book as a way to honor and to recognize those individuals who sang songs of freedom, right? But we don't necessarily know all of the stories and the songs that they sang. So it's important for us to remember them, and I hope that this book in some ways is a memorial and serves as a memorial to many of these generations of enslaved people. So what I'm about to read are sections actually from the introduction of the book. And I thought it might be a way to introduce some of the important, or at least the elements that I consider important in the book, and as a way to open up and provide a little bit even of a summary in some ways, which we'll talk about later as well. So all of this comes from the introduction. Know that this was about 10 pages and we cut it down to 2. Okay, all right, don't worry about that though. All right. Okay, so the White Witch of Rose Hall, Annie Palmer, is remembered as a particularly notorious mistress whose lovers included both Englishmen and men enslaved on her plantation. Most stories emphasize her supposed numerous, heinous, and supernatural deeds: the murder of 3 English husbands, her excessively brutal treatment of the persons enslaved on her plantation, and, as legend goes, her ghost haunting the Rose Hall Great House and grounds today. Indeed, as the contemporary Rose Hall Great House tours highlight, Annie Palmer's life supposedly ended tragically when her previously enslaved lover, named Taku, killed her as an act of revenge for her lethal curse on his granddaughter, Millicent. These details of Annie Palmer's legend have circulated widely in Jamaica and throughout the world. In fact, every year, more than 100,000 persons visit Rose Hall. Over the decades, visitors have shared pictures and stories, keeping the legend alive into the present day. The narrative in the Rose Hall Great House tours materialized from Herbert de Lissa's 1929 novel entitled The White Witch of Rose Hall. Due to limited historical and factual information about Annie Palmer, de Lissa utilized the fertile ground of these historical gaps to concoct this legend about a White Witch of Rose Hall. As a result, the only historical facts included in de Lissa's novel and the Rose Hall tours are that a woman named Annie Palmer lived at Rose Hall between 1820 and 1830, and that she was the white mistress of Rose Hall during those years. Those are the only facts included. Everything else, all other details about Annie Palmer described in de Lissa's novel and the tours are entirely fictional, including, but not limited to, the information about Annie Palmer's and her parents' connections and time spent in Haiti, Annie Palmer being raised by a, quote, voodoo priestess, end quote, in Haiti, Annie Palmer's marriage to 3 Englishmen, her murdering these 3 husbands, and her being killed by a previously enslaved man named Taku during a slave revolt. In addition to these fictional depictions of Annie Palmer in both the novel and the tours, the Great House tours often conclude at what is supposed to be Annie Palmer's final resting place, a coffin on the Rose Hall property. Whether the remains of any person are in that coffin is unclear, but if there are any, they do not belong to Annie Palmer. Annie Palmer's final resting place is in the Montego Bay churchyard, though her grave is not marked. In a similar vein, visitors mistakenly assume that the Rose Hall Great House is a museum. Simply stated, it is not a museum. Instead, the Rose Hall Great House operates as a tourist site with fictional information passed and presented as the history of the site. The official Rose Hall Great House website, too, revolves around the myth of Annie Palmer. That focus extends into the Rose Hall tours, as Annie Palmer's experiences and presence, ghostly presence, remain pivotal throughout the tours, while enslaved women's experiences are entirely discounted, neglected, and silenced. Yet, it is not that these tours entirely ignore the presence of enslaved women. At random moments during the tour, a couple of black women appearing seemingly out of nowhere, acting as ghosts of enslaved women engaged in different household duties, appear throughout these particular tours. They are dressed completely in white, and their faces are powdered white as well. They express no words or utterances at any point in the performance. What are we to make of their ghostly appearances? How does their liminality function as a witness to slavery's past without personifying and demonstrating the horrors of bondage? How do their bodies simultaneously represent a palpable marker of slavery while serving as neutralized tourist props? Why are the names of enslaved women and their actual lived experiences secretly cast into the shadows of the Rose Hall tours? Even though slavery's ritualized acts of terror and trauma are not presented during the Rose Hall tours, these gaps and silences surrounding the stories of enslaved persons in these tours today become a contemporary form of perpetual violence, reinscribed at the site of slavery. Even as the voices of enslaved women at Rose Hall, such as Penella, Kate, Celia, and Peachy, remain stifled and silenced in the Rose Hall tours, even as enslavers of the days of yore denied their maximal humanity, the actual presence and experiences of enslaved women could not be entirely silenced. The first part of this book's title invokes Michel Rolfe Trio's Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, and I emphasize the process of what I refer to as unsilencing slavery. To be clear, slavery was not a quiet, secretive, or silent institution. Rather, it was resounding and deafening in its private and public, covert and overt demonstrations of pain, terror, torture, and trauma. In the notices of slave auctions and sales, in the regular, persistent, and often relentless advertisements for runaway slaves, in the accounting and calculations of births and deaths of enslaved women, men, and children, in the absolute refusal to grant the most fundamental human rights and civic privileges to enslaved persons, and in the practice of brandings, whippings, maimings, rapes, decapitations, murders, and executions, as well as countless other forms of emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual violences. The archives have often functioned and been deployed as a kind of historical cover for the depth and breadth of these violations. In conclusion here, there will always be unanswered questions about the lived experiences of enslaved persons. However, the questions we pose and the stories we imagine, consider, and tease out about their lives provide a vital lens in crafting a human and humane story of enslaved persons. History telling itself serves as a modality to express some sense of the fullness of enslaved persons' spirits, the capaciousness of Black humanity, and a reclamation and declaration that enslaved Black lives mattered at Rose Hall Plantation and on all plantations in the Americas. The unrelenting timbers and sounds of slavery and its silences permeate the archives, and I ask you to attend to these silences of dehumanization and marginalization, etched throughout the accounting of enslaved people's laborious routines at Rose Hall. Yet not all silences were noisy and satiated with contempt and condemnation. Some enslaved people at Rose Hall may have generated, protected, and maintained silences beyond the recognition and gaze of Rose Hall's enslavers and overseers. Sacred silences, not to be shared or detected by those deemed outside the boundaries of the community of enslaved knowers. Even as the overseers scribed their brief notes and numbers in the Rose Hall Journal as a way of accounting for the enslaved persons and their respective duties and responsibilities, enslaved persons at Rose Hall were also noting, cherishing, and attending to their individual and collective thoughts, feelings, words, actions, and dreams of freedom. Thank you for listening.
Wow. We just absorbed quite a bit. So let's kind of break it down. I first want to start by saying that I am a big fan of retellings. And this, in essence, is a retelling. My favorite book, and I promote this book, I recommend this book, I tell everybody to read this book, is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. And if you've read the classic Jane Eyre, then you would know about the mad Creole woman that is very minimally represented in the book. And Jean Rhys takes this minimal character and gives her an entire history and creates a whole storyline behind the mad Creole woman and humanizes her. And so I feel like that's basically what you have done here, is to take these silenced figures, the enslaved, the marginalized, the voiceless, and you have given them context, and you have given them history, and you've made them whole, you've made them persons. So I must commend you on that first and foremost. But then I want to go on to say that you are debunking some historical things that have been embedded in our culture. That's a very bold step. So my first question to you is, you've mentioned in the beginning of the book why you know what sparked your interest, your visit with your daughter and noticing certain things. I read that. But what made you decide, I am going to sit down and do all this research and put together a literary item? What made you decide that I want to talk about the persons who are not mentioned in the history of Rose Hall Plantation?
Thank you for that question. It's a big question. How much time we have till midnight, right? Something like that to answer that. So certainly at the beginning, I talk about how myself and my daughter in 2013 went to visit Rose Hall Plantation. And certainly I'd heard about it, as a child growing up in Jamaica, but I'd never actually visited. And as we went through, my daughter was 13 at the time. She and everybody else, except for me, were just completely interested and excited about all the different movements and, people going through, right? The, Taku makes an appearance, right? And is running through screaming at one point during the tour. And the whole time that I was there, I just kept saying to my daughter, who was not very pleased by this, what kind of craziness is this? Like, what is actually happening here? Like, what is happening here? And she was just like, Mommy, just, and at that point, I did not, even after leaving, I didn't think I was going to write a book about it. I wondered whether somebody had already written something about it. And I realized no one had. Nothing substantive, at least. And, putting all the pieces together. And it seemed to me that something should be written. And I thought to myself, maybe, just maybe, I could write a short article, maybe 10 pages. I could do something like that. If I look through I went to the archives. I assumed the archives would be in Jamaica and in England, which are the places that I visited, in order to pull the materials together. And I thought, if I could just find one name, or maybe two names, but just a couple names that I could include, right? And I had a sense that Taku was probably not one of the names. And in fact, he is not Taku. There is no reference to Taku at all. And no reference to a Millicent either. And it's part of my own work, is about trying to be a scholar of enslaved people. So another colleague who now teaches at UC Santa Barbara talks about herself and describes herself not as a scholar of slavery, but a scholar of enslaved people. And I see myself very much in that trajectory and as part of that lineage. And in other work, I certainly try to expose, to seek out, to unravel the stories of previously enslaved people in the United States, in the Cherokee Nation, in that indigenous nation. And so that part of it was not new to me, right? What was new was finally being able to work on a project in Jamaica, something I had wanted to do for a very, very long time. So that was really important to me, just as being here and this book being launched, even with a tropical storm going on outside, was really important for me to have the first book launch be here in Jamaica. So certainly in terms of the writing of this, that was a whole process, a very long journey. And I was not sure what would come of it. At some point, probably just a couple of years ago, I thought, I think I might have more than an article here. I think I might actually have a book, like maybe a short book, but it'll be a book. And that was just, important to me that it could be something longer, though I think I would have been just as satisfied if it had been a short article, actually. So long answer, but yes, that's the
Okay, so as you talk about the fact that you initially started, thinking of an article and then going into a book, I'm going to ask you two questions in one. I want to find out how long it took you to really put everything together, because this book is very extensive. And guys, no, I don't mean extensive that you can't read it because it's too much information. I just mean that the depth of research that is done is exemplary, and it's not superficial. It's obvious that you went to great lengths to ensure that, you know, that your data was accurate, and that, you know, the book is sufficiently supported. So I want to know, you mentioned briefly just now that you flew to the UK as a part of getting your information together. So I want to know how long it took you to get everything together, and I want to know what the process was like for you and the sources that you incorporated. You know, tell us a little bit about how you brought all your information together and how long it took.
Big question again. Okay, all right. So it took, I mean, after we were here for the tour, and that was my daughter's first time here, and certainly I had been back and forth to Jamaica since we left in 1977. And over the last few years, really a couple of times, as much as possible per year being here. But I would say probably 5 years of working through the material. And a couple of those years were really focused in the archive. So the Armstrong family would see me going to Spanish Town on a daily basis whenever I was here. And if you haven't been to the Jamaica Archives in Spanish Town, I would encourage you to visit. The other place that I reluctantly visited, and I want to make sure I include that it was reluctant, was actually England, and looking at the National Archives in London, in Kew, in the UK. And it's interesting because so many people, when I talk about going to the archives, everybody is like, oh, yes, the archives in London, they're just so beautiful. And there's this wonderful pond out, and there are swans, and there's a cafe, and it's just so lovely. And I actually felt angry, I guess would be the only way, one of the emotions, that I had to go to the UK, right, in order to work on this project on Rose Hall in Jamaica. That even in the process of the research journey, that neo-colonial and colonial processes were still in place, right? So that all that as far as I was concerned, all that I wanted to look at should have been right here in Jamaica. I shouldn't have had to go to England. So I say that. So probably, yes, 5 or 6 years. The two major pieces that I utilized for this in order to gather the information about the 208 enslaved persons who are highlighted in the book really came from the Rose Hall Journal, which is a journal only found in Spanish Town in the Jamaica Archives. And it's about 1,000 handwritten pages. And there are a couple, I think David has a couple, we did a few, pages of it and expanded it a little bit so that people could see it. So that took a significant amount of time. So it wasn't so much that it took a long time to find the journal, though I found it early on there in the Jamaica Archives. But the time it takes to actually go through, and, I couldn't see well to begin with, right? And let's be clear, I can't see the big E. The big E, when you did it, you can't see the big E anymore. Anyway, TMI. But anyhow, so going through that, and I want to make sure to mention a research assistant of mine at the time, Monique Williams, a Jamaican student who graduated from Columbia in 2017, and she was on the journey with me from close to the beginning when I started going through the material. She was in a class of mine on Caribbean women, and that's how we met initially. And over these last several years, she has looked at many of these records for me to help me sort of craft it, to think through it. She's looked at the book. She looked at the book proposal, and even at the very end, helped significantly with the website. So graduated in 2017, but there was always a time I'm like, Monique, you willing to? I paid her, by the way. Let's be clear. I study slavery, but I don't practice it. And so she was always willing to help. So I want to mention that too, that in many ways it was a solo process, but it was so helpful to have somebody like Monique as a research assistant, so that there were certain times where I wanted to kind of work through it with her. So I want to mention her. So several years, and then to put it together, there were some of my friends who suggested it be 2 books, because the very beginning, the first 3 chapters are really a presentation and extraction of the archival materials, right? And the 4th chapter is focused on Delisser's novel. It's a literary critique. I'm not a literary critic, but the whatever I could do with it that I've learned over the years, from people like Grace's sister Faith Smith at Brandeis, that I certainly tried to use those literary chops. And then the last chapter talks solely about the tours. And so I wanted it to be all of the pieces, right? Not only the archival material, but also what was done by Delisser in terms of this particular kind of story, and the mythology of it, and then the tours to the present day. So all of those pieces took a significant amount of time to get me to the book being published this year in 2022. So I would say starting in 2015 to the present day. Yeah. What was the other part? It was another part. Is that kind of...
You've definitely answered it. We wanted to know. I say we because I'm talking on behalf of everybody. We, the audience, we wanted to know how long. We just wanted a little insight into the research process, which you definitely shared with us just now. The length, the period of time, and some of the sources that you incorporated in executing the book. I love the fact that your research assistant is Jamaican, and I love the fact that she's a female. I'm assuming that she identifies as a female, but I definitely love that as a symbolic, as a representation of exactly what you were trying to do. It's females empowering females. So your students of your scholars of enslaved people as women who are researching about enslaved women and giving voice to these women. I thought that was, I don't know, I just thought that was very, very sweet, and I'm glad that you were able to have her as a research assistant, and I'm pretty sure that she was empowered in the process, because I know I can speak on behalf of everyone here. I've never done the tour myself, but when I think of Rose Hall, I only think of Annie Palmer, the Wicked Witch of Rose Hall. I've never at any point in time even fathomed that there's a what are the names of the panel? I've never even thought here are some other people that existed in that time, in that space. So I think it's a whole cycle that you had going on here, and that's why we can never ignore the process of authors, because there's just so much serendipity that takes place and so much that comes together. So I love the fact that you had her as a research assistant. I'm pretty sure that she has changed another aspect of thought, because if she's studying gender studies and she's looking as a person in the diaspora, I'm sure this now has given her a whole different thought of Rose Hall and even other aspects of our history. So I loved that. You did mention the Jamaica Archives in Spanish Town. I want to just step a little bit from the inside of the book, and I want to just zoom into the outside of the book. I'm going to borrow this copy here and hold it up for everyone to see. Love the choice of colors that you used. First, I want to know if this is a copy. Is this a copy of the archive? Are we looking at a part of the archive on the cover of the book? So that's something that I had noticed, and I wanted to know if it was an authentic piece of the artifacts that you found.
Yes.
So I think that's pretty cool. I don't know if we really give enough credit to the covers of these books and how important they are to the context that is inside. So I want to know, how did this come about? Were you instrumental in creating the cover? Who created the cover? Was the person Jamaican? Let us know how you came about putting this cover together, because it's minimalistic, but it is such a powerful cover.
Thank you for that. I have to say, from the outside to the very end, in terms of the index, I was very involved. I think even with the cover, they were like at the very end, okay, this is it for the changes. I'm like, well, the green, not as green as I want, and the gold, not quite as gold, and the red somehow. And they were like, we just have to stop at this point. But one of the things that I said to the University of Georgia Press, who is the publisher, who did an amazing job, and certainly I think my acknowledgments in the book is either 8 or 9 pages long. As a friend of mine says, the longest acknowledgments ever in history. But anyhow, I believe the acknowledgments are important. But from the very beginning, I knew one thing, right? That I had all these pictures I'd taken over years, and I have gone through the tours probably about 15 times, maybe closer to 20. And it was important for me to just see how different women, Jamaican women primarily, presented it. I mean, there is a set tour narrative, but sometimes for those who've been there a little bit longer, they include different pieces of it. And I wanted to have that experience of it. But anyway, with the cover, the one thing I knew was that I didn't want the Great House to be on the cover in any significant way, right? And certainly I had many pictures of the house. I had taken many pictures inside of the house as well. And I knew I didn't want that on the cover. And we don't have any pictures, at least from this time period that I focus on, the very early 1800s, of any enslaved person at Rose Hall. That is not to say that in some collections, in some homes here in Jamaica and abroad, that people might have some images of previously enslaved persons in their 70s or 80s, right, in photo albums, right? But in terms of the early 19th century, I had none for Rose Hall. So the only way I could imagine at least presenting them on the cover was to utilize the slave registers. And I've also brought sort of larger copies of those because it's hard to see in the book because it's very faint, right? So these are slave registers, lists of enslaved persons that started in Jamaica in the 18 teens. For Rose Hall, it starts in 1817, and they're triennial. So it's, every 3 years. So there's 1817, 1820, 23, 26, 29. And then the last one is from 1832. And so the cover is actually from the very first one in 1817. And there are about 5 pages, five pages. There are the lists of the enslaved men at Rose Hall that begins the list, and then it ends with the enslaved women and girls. The page I selected is the one that includes Celia's name and Cecilia's name. Cecilia was an African-born woman at Rose Hall, and Celia was a Creole woman. That is, a person who was not born on the African continent, but someone who was born in the Americas. Probably Jamaica, but not necessarily, just because of the movement of enslaved persons from different parts of the Americas, right? So I wanted it to be the page where we had a list of the women, and then on this in this particular slave register that lists everybody, right, the very first one in 1817, it also includes some other information. So you can see some of it here. It's terms like Negro, Sambo, mulatto, right, often referred to as the person's color. Negro being the term that was utilized, that the person was probably solely of African descent. Mulatto was the term that was used if one parent was of African descent and the other parent was of European descent. Sambo was the term that was used if a parent was mulatto and another parent was solely of African descent. There are other terms that are included, not on this page, like quadroon, right? And then there's also the age of these individuals at the time in 1817. And then also it includes whether the person, again, was either identified as African, as in African born, or Creole, non-African born, but American born, right? And when I say American, the Americas, right? Could be in Brazil, could be Jamaica, could be Barbados, could be Cuba, right? So in the Americas. And then there was also this information, not for everybody, but for some of them. So here you see the words daughter of, right? And so there was often that included for those who were clear, right, about them being the daughter of a particular enslaved woman or the son of a particular enslaved woman. There is no information on these slave registers that includes who the biological fathers were. Right? When we talk about chattel slavery in Jamaica and throughout the Americas, it's important to realize that white enslavers only included and focused on the enslaved women, right, in the records that they left behind about who actually gave birth to these enslaved children. That there is a law that is created in various parts of the Americas at different times even, right, that is called the Partus Law, Partus Sequitur Ventrum, that essentially means that the child will follow, right, the condition or the status of the mother, right? So if an enslaved woman had a child, that child was automatically enslaved. It did not matter if the biological father was an enslaved Jamaican man in this particular case, or a free man of color in Jamaica, or a white man in Jamaica. All of the children of enslaved women were automatically and legally enslaved as well. We can think about how this was really important in terms of a capitalist society and a plantocracy and a slaveocracy, so that no matter who the father was, that those children then belonged to the person who described themselves as the owner, the slave owner of the enslaved mother, right? So it was important for me to have this. And then if you actually look closely, there is a picture of Rose Hall, the great house, on here. And what I asked them to do was to blacken it out. So right here is actually the front of Rose Hall Great House, right? Because in the end, it was important to note the site itself, but not for it to be prominent. And I like the idea of it being blackened out, right? The colors, right? Gold, green, red, Rastafari colors. But I also wanted the colors of Jamaica to be prominent, right? And so in many ways, the blackened out, right, is part of the black of the Jamaican flag, and of course the green, and then the gold as well, right? So that was also a way that the blackened out did double duty, if you will, right? And then that's about it, right? And the Unsilencing Slavery, I already explained sort of where the title comes from in my own telling of it. So yeah. So there was a designer who put these pieces together, but they followed my instructions perfectly and did a beautiful job of it as well.
They absolutely did a beautiful job. I think this is a very, as I said before, a very powerful cover. The literature major in me wants to go further to say that the in red representing the blood, representing the rising up of the blood of the enslaved and removing the silence. So wow, I think you did exceptionally well with the cover, and I think it complements what is inside. I'm going to ask a quick question about a point that you just made, maybe another question, and then I'm going to open the floor if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. You mentioned that the archive does not have information on the fathers of these enslaved children or individuals. Do you think that was another channel that was used to demasculate enslaved men and to ensure that it was always, persons were always represented as being property or being responsibilities or ownership of the slave masters who left the records behind?
You said that, no, clear, and you said that beautifully. So I don't even have to answer that. Just what she said, what Shanique said, that. Absolutely, Shanique. And, certainly there are ways that process operated to erase and also to compromise the integrity of a sense of fatherhood, a sense of manhood, a sense of personhood, right? All of those simultaneously. I think it's important, and I mentioned this too in the book, to recognize that, there's often that saying, right? Though I don't know that it's given a specific African community or African site, about it takes a village to raise a child, right? And one of the things that I wanted to do, it comes across somewhat in the book, but more so on the website. And on the website, as well as in the book, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't necessarily about a man and a woman raising children at Rose Hall Plantation, and really at plantations across the Americas. It was about a community and communities of people, right? So even though we don't have in the archives, right, specific names of the biological fathers of these enslaved children, that it's important to think and to imagine beyond that, right? To imagine men, and sometimes fairly young men, and sometimes elderly men, right, who nurtured and fathered children who were not biologically theirs, right? Just as we understand that there were enslaved women who mothered and nurtured children who were not theirs biologically either, right? And that instead of thinking about some sort of family cocoon, right, and a limited sense of family, that part of what I want us to always remember is, and imagine, is an expansive, a really capacious sense of family and of community, right? We have to actually do that because so many enslaved children were separated from their biological fathers and biological mothers. So the very process of bondage, the very process of a forcible separation of kinship, and people who consider themselves to be kin biologically, meant that other kinds of families, other kinds of communities had to be imagined and practiced, right? So another wonderful scholar, Sasha Turner, who also writes amazing books and articles about Jamaican women. She's also Jamaican, and teaches at Johns Hopkins University right now in the U.S. Talks about examples, right, of other women, other enslaved women breastfeeding other women's children, right, and different reasons for that, right? And so that's a very specific example, and to think about not solely those kinds of acts, but to think about how emotionally, psychologically, and holistically people nurtured, fathered, mothered other people's children to the extent that there was not a necessary, I should say, division between this child is not biologically mine, so I don't have the same kind of connection as if that child would be biologically mine, right? That there's no way for us to know how Celia or Cecilia or Penella or any of these enslaved women, as well as men like, Apollo or Hercules or Archie or Mercury. We don't know how these men also imagined themselves as nurturing other children, enslaved children, whether or not they were biological fathers at all. Right? So it is important to think about these enslaved women and these enslaved men as part of these communities, but not necessarily nuclear families, right, that are separate from each other, but actually as part of a default in terms of the institution of slavery, that they had to make other kinds of connections. There are certainly scholars who talk about expansive notions within West African and West Central African communities, right, about families and the ways that some of these individuals who are African born and extended that to American, again, Jamaican, Americas born children may also have included that in some way. It may have been shaped and informed by their ideas of an expansive notion of family to begin with, right? Part of what they brought with them. Right. So to think as expansively as possible is what I just want to leave you with that.
I feel like this is not even about the launch. This is like us going into a deep conversation about ourselves, our ancestry, our lives. And now I'm getting so confused. No need to be sorry, because that's the thing about having a conversation. It allows us to not be robotic in what we are representing. It allows us to be as authentic in the information that really is to be brought out to the persons that are here today and everyone that is tuned in. But it's so funny that you mentioned and everything that you just said. I just immediately thought about how strategic enslavers were in creating confusion. It's almost like breaking the spirit of an animal. I feel like legacy and lineage are erased, and that allows for the removal of identity. And without identity and without that strength is removed, and that allows them to continue to colonialize the persons that they had as their enslaved. So I every time we have persons who bring bodies of work that seek to allow these enslaved persons who had identities ripped from them, whose culture was suppressed and subdued, it's another step in bringing them forward and bringing them forth, which is what I believe you have done here in this book. So,
can I say one thing to that? Is that
sure.
One of the things, and that that just reminded me, when we think about lineage, right, that it is often seen as a lineage based on fathers, right? It's the father's line. And so we want to be clear, too, that a lot of that is Eurocentric. Right? And so that it is important to recognize the presence and the support and the love of fathers and men who may or may not have been biological fathers at Rose Hall. But we also want to understand that in many communities, whether we're talking about West African or West Central African communities or indigenous communities in the Americas, that not all of those communities were patrilineal. In fact, some were matrilineal and matrifocal. So we want to also at least recognize the ways that lineage, in terms of the father's line being the primary line, right, and the father's name being the primary name, and how that still circulates in some parts of our world today, that was very much tied to notions of property. right? Not only property in terms of goods, right, to be passed on to other children, but property that came to be represented in terms of human beings as property. So Jennifer Morgan, another wonderful scholar, who's one of the editors for this series for UGA Press Gender and Slavery series, in one of her first books, Laboring Women, talks about how in the wills of European and European Caribbean enslavers in Barbados as well as in South Carolina, and it wasn't special just to those places, happened in other places too, that even in their wills they would include the names of enslaved women, sometimes even enslaved girls. And in their wills, they would say, and this particular enslaved girl, whatever children she has, the children from her will go to this son or this, daughter of mine. And even though those children had never been born yet, right? This idea of recognizing enslaved women as the very vector of their property and intergenerational, I should say, wealth, and the passing down of that wealth through enslaved women's bodies, through enslaved persons, right? And so how they imagined those women to have children that would be human property for them, that would be associated with a particular kind of monetary value, right? And that was also part of their understanding of their lineage, right? I mean, the whole Elizabeth II, we won't get into it, but we can see how that plays out too. Okay, all right. Okay.
Yeah. And we'll leave that question right there. Okay, so my last question is going to be twofold. And then I am going to open the floor so that you guys can ask your questions, because if I don't wrap this up, we're going to be here until 9 o'clock. Unsilencing Slavery here with Professor Naylor. So I wanted to know this. Okay, maybe it's going to be 3 parts. So I want to know let me just go to my book so that I'm very specific, because I have so many opinions now from the things that you've said that I need to stay on track. I have to stay on track. So I want to know why you think that the Rose Hall Great House tours do not focus more on the true element or true essence of slavery that took place, why it focuses so much on Annie Palmer and her history, according to what was stated, that you have made very clear to us are not facts. And then I want to know why you think Jamaicans view slavery the way that they do, particularly in reference to Rose Hall and how we see Rose Hall, and how we actually sadly so glorify Annie Palmer. We almost embrace her as our own, like, oh yes, the White Witch of Rose Hall, as if it is a grand thing. And then I would love to know what the feedback has been regarding the book from your family, your friends, your colleagues, and then we'll open the floor.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. All right, that's a big. When you said 3 parts, I knew we were going to. All right. So let me see if I can remember. Yes, I probably will ask you to do that. So first, the one I remember, in terms of the tours and why the focus on Annie Palmer. So Rose Hall is not exceptional in terms of plantation sites that are utilized as tourist sites that focus on the European or European American slave owners, the enslavers, and not on the enslaved people. So I want to say that that's not exceptional, right, in terms of Rose Hall. Not all of them have a whole ghost story, though, right? So that in some ways stands out, though there are other plantation sites that also have different kinds of ghost stories related to enslaved persons. It is, after all, at Rose Hall, when you go, right, that this is not free. Right? That you pay, it's either $20 or $25 US dollars if there's a discount going on. So I've paid $20 mostly when I did it. And then there's a lower price for kids. I think it's maybe $10 for them. So when you go, you are paying for that particular tourist site, as you pay for other tourist sites too, right? So above all else, it's a business. Right? It is important to realize that Rose Hall Great House and the acres and acres on which it is built, as well as other hotels and other businesses in that area, are owned by a white American family that is primarily based in Delaware, called the Rollins family. Right? So all the funds, right, those payments of 20 or 20, again, 100,000 people per year, right? I wasn't great at math, but I was pretty good at math in school, right? At Holy Childhood right here. But anyway, so that it is a business venture, right? And certainly there are ways that the Rollins family makes donations to schools in Montego Bay. And to other schools as well, right? Definitely. But that they are making a great deal of money off of those tours. And to be clear, that is only a small piece of it, right? There are destination weddings that happen at Rose Hall Great House that you pay a significant amount of money to also have your wedding there. And certainly year after year, people do that as well. So one, I just want to point out the sort of business venture that it is. And then I tried to get in touch with Michelle Rollins, who is the current major owner, though the children of John Rollins and Michelle Rollins and his previous wives. He passed in 2000, and he's the person who actually purchased it in the late 1950s. Right? He'd visited Jamaica many times and fell in love with Jamaica and bought this and renovated the house for about $2 to $3 million US dollars. So that it is a business venture, and it is also, because of the ghost story, that is attractive to so many people, like it was to my daughter and everybody else that night. And so that's an important piece of it, right? A form of entertainment, if you will, right? We might not necessarily put entertainment and slavery together, but somehow they've been able to do that at Rose Hall Great House, right? It's also important to realize that if they, in fact, spoke more about slavery, it's not clear that visitors would want to go to the Rose Hall Great House tour, right? And go through that tour. It is certainly... It's absolutely palatable. But it's also true that other plantation sites in parts of the United States and in other places have created tours focused on slavery that they charge for. So it is actually possible for them to profit from it and create something that focuses on enslaved persons. They haven't chosen to do that yet, but that would be a possibility. So I think the reason is it's a business decision, right? And it's a way of really focusing on Jamaican lore and not necessarily on Jamaican history, right? The second question was... How do you think why do you think Jamaicans view slavery? Oh, yeah. So I'll say this. I think that there are a range of understandings and reactions to the history of slavery in Jamaica by Jamaicans, right? That if we went out in the streets right now, okay, many people not on the streets because of the tropical storm, but okay, if we went out in the streets, or even if we went around right now in this room, not everybody would have the same sense of what slavery meant in Jamaica or what the history of slavery means to them, right? There would probably be different perspectives on that, right? And as human beings, of course, we have different perspectives. the issue, and certainly Professor Vereen Shepard, who teaches at UA Mona in the history department and has done a lot of amazing work on slavery as well as the whole CARICOM process regarding reparations. And so she's, hopefully you know of her, and if not, certainly read her work. That she talks about sort of the shame of slavery that many Jamaicans feel in reference to slavery in Jamaica. Something that should be cast aside, something that should not be highlighted in any way, right? And so it's that kind of shame related to slavery. And part of the reason for that shame is because we actually don't know the full stories of enslaved persons in Jamaica and in other places. Because if we actually did, there would be more pride than shame involved. But because we often see slavery through a very European perspective and the perspective of enslavers, all we can sometimes imagine is the shame of it, the burden of bondage, right? Rather than thinking about the freedom fighters and thinking about those who were enslaved in body, but certainly not enslaved in mind, right? So that's part of the pushback, right? And even up until last year, there were articles in the Gleaner talking about, why we have to keep, remembering and celebrating Emancipation Day. Like, we need to just let that go, right? And so part of that is also in response to it, right? There's a way that Independence Day, right? Jamaica's independence on August 6, 1962, and commemorating that is something that is prideful, right, is something that should be celebrated, but not actually Emancipation Day on August 1st, right? And to think about the generations, I mean, really Emancipation Day is something that we celebrate every year here, but it is also a way of honoring people who were enslaved, who fought, right, in many different ways. And sometimes it was just a thought that bondage was wrong, a thought that they were free and should be recognized as free people, right? But were enslaved by chains and by laws and by so many other means. So to think about, Emancipation Day is a way of honoring those countless, right, generations of Jamaicans who were enslaved and some who became free people of color before abolition, right, in Jamaica. So I think it is about the shame of slavery that is part of, not everything, but certainly, as Professor Shepard talks about it and others too, part of the reason why some Jamaicans don't respond favorably to celebrations that invoke slavery or invoke emancipation. I would say just one thing, and then I'll briefly mention the last question that you had, that it's really important to think about the difference between emancipation and freedom. And emancipation itself is a legal status change, right? It is to be emancipated legally, is to no longer be enslaved and now to be recognized as a free person. Freedom is much more capacious than emancipation, right? There were people, enslaved people, who were fully aware of their free beings, right? Who were enslaved legally, right? And whether, again, it was a thought or whether they ran away or whether they poisoned an enslaver, right, in order to be free, whether, in fact, they killed themselves in order to be free, right? That there are different ways that they imagined and took action in terms of their freedom, but it wasn't always a physical action. Again, it could also have just been a thought of freedom. And I want us to remember that too. So the final question was...
What the support has been like from
yeah.
friends?
So I would say that... the support of family, friends, colleagues has been wonderful. It has been wonderful. And I wish my parents had lived to see it in fruition, right? This actual book, because both of them were wonderful storytellers. And, my mother passed in 2020, my father a few years before that. And I actually have 4 copies of the Rose Hall, the big Legend of Rose Hall book, because my father had bought it at some point, right? And then there were a couple other copies in there. Who knows who bought those? And then I bought one thinking this was the first one in the collection. And then when I was going through their materials, I was like, how many Rose Hall books do we need in this family? But anyhow, so that is my only regret, is that they passed before it was fully published. But we're absolute supporters as my brother and sister and family, and again colleagues at Barnard Columbia, and certainly friends like Grace's sister Faith and the Armstrongs here and others as well. So I deeply appreciate that.
That's lovely. I feel like we need to have a conversation off the air about how Jamaicans feel in terms of that attachment to the monarchy. We'll talk about that off the air. We won't get into that tonight. But now it is your opportunity to have a go at Prof. Naylor. We will be having meet and greet after. So if you're a little shy and you'd like to keep your question for a one-on-one with her, that is also possible. But we are now opening the floor if anyone has any questions at this time. Okay.
Mrs.
Armstrong.
Celia, I'm so proud of you. I'm privileged. I was privileged to see a part of that process. And waving Celia as she went off to halfway tree to go on public transportation to go to Spanish Town. Yes, she did. She did not take the easy way. No. She was doing it in a very authentic way. I would love for you to relive some of those moments, those emotions that you had when you were turning those pages, seeing the handwritten records and names. What were your emotions, especially when you saw Celia amongst those names?
That's a wonderful question.
It is a wonderful question. I think so much, even in classes today, about history of the Caribbean or history of other parts of the Americas that focuses on slavery. Often talks about the percentages, the millions, right? One count is 12 million. People who were forcibly relocated from parts of West Africa and West Central Africa to the Americas, right? And certainly the majority of those people ended up in Brazil. But certainly a significant percentage also ended up in a place like Jamaica and Cuba and Barbados and Antigua and many parts of the Americas. But there's quite a focus on the numbers, the calculations. And I think it is important to have a sense of that, right? Again, one estimate, 12 million were left the shores, and about 10 million or so actually arrived here in the Americas, right? Some say that those are very low numbers, that it is much more than 12 million and much more than 10 million, right? And much more than 2 million who are at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, right? So the focus on numbers is something that is important historically, but in some ways it reinscribes a sense of dehumanization of the individual persons themselves. And so it was really important for me, like I said, when I left, I just wanted some names, some actual names of enslaved persons. And then when I finally got to the slave registers and saw the names, I had to stop, right? I mean, it was what I wanted. I was grateful that those archives were available, that they still existed, right? And I could have access to them, right? I could have not had access to any of these materials. And it is to remember the humanity of these persons, right? And a name is one way, and certainly not all of their names were created or associated or out of families, right? Out of other people who were connected to them. Some of these names were created and decided by the enslavers, right? So even getting to the names doesn't necessarily mean that we get to their full humanity or individual choices that members of their family made, right? Certainly some did, but I can't say 100%, right? But to see Celia was hard, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that the names are one piece of it, and to be reminded to use the names as a very, very tiny window into their full humanity, right? But at least we have that. And it was important for me to add as many pieces of their stories, of their lives, for the website, so that each of the 208 enslaved persons has something written about them, right? And it didn't matter whether they appeared just one time, briefly, in the archives, in the archival documents, or were mentioned several times, right? And sometimes they're mentioned because it's a record of their birth, and in the same slave register there is a record of their passing, maybe at 4 days or 5 days or 5 months or 5 years. All of those souls were important to me to have a moment, right? Especially since they don't have that moment right now in the tours. But it was difficult. It was really. And it remains so, obviously, to reflect on that. So, thank you.
Okay, that was a great question, and I commend you for being able to answer it and still be in one piece. Even just writing this book, I would love to know how. If you had moments where you broke down. But before you answer that, let me just give you a question from online. Trisha wants to know if you've considered writing a literary novel of the names you found in your research from the persons who lived at Rose Hall. And then you can let us know the various emotions you went through, because it was one thing to collate the information, to find the information, to put it all together, but then to start putting the story together, to start penning. It's almost like you were drawing these people to life. You were creating a full human of them as you put their pieces together. So can you tell us what that was like for you? And also, as I repeat the question, have you considered writing a literary novel of the names of the persons you found?
Thanks for those great questions too. The first one, there is a friend and colleague of mine named Professor Taya Miles, who writes wonderful histories, but also writes wonderful novels, and crosses all kinds of literary genres, and has been quite an inspiration to me over the many decades that we have known each other. It is something I've thought about. I would say the follow-up story to this, and the follow-up project that I wanted to do, and COVID and other things have gotten in the way, is I wanted to actually talk to descendants of the people, right, of the enslaved persons, many of whom still live in the area in Montego Bay, right? And so for me, it was in the U.S., when I do work on previously enslaved people, we have these interviews, right, of previously enslaved persons. And from the 1930s and 1940s, many of these are, in their 70s, 80s, etc., right? Were very young when slavery was abolished there. And we actually don't have those kinds of interviews. And so I wanted to add to the archives, right? Because any stories that any of the people living today might have heard about a grandfather or a grandmother or a great-great-grandmother or great-great-grandfather who said something about Rose Hall and how they might have been remembered through the generations, that to me was the next moment, the next journey. And I haven't fully put that aside yet. But yeah, so I appreciate the recommendation of writing a literary novel. I appreciate the challenge of that recommendation, and I'll think about that. So thank you for that. I appreciate the confidence too.
And your emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a full range, right, of emotions, in terms of sadness, to exhilaration, actually, when a previously enslaved person has run away and them not caught, right? There's no record of that. So one experience, I mean, and don't know what happened to them, but know that they weren't brought back. Many of the notations, it's interesting, the terminology, but many of the notations about people who are described as runaway slaves, right? Who run away, and certainly there are some like Arabella, who runs away over 15 times, right? Hercules runs away over 25 times, right? So there are people who do this once, right? And decide not to. They're pregnant women, right? Who run away. Susanna Johnston runs away twice, one summer, July and August, and her child is born in December, and 3 days later that child passes, right? So there are a range of people running away, but the excitement that they aren't caught, right, is something that, so in terms of terminology, what I wanted to mention is in the overseers in the Rose Hall Journal, these are the daily reports of what's happening at Rose Hall from 1817 to 1832. We'll say, Hercules brought home, right, on such and such date. And it's, of course, interesting to think about whether these individuals thought about Rose Hall as home. And perhaps some did, because somebody like Celia not only had children at Rose Hall, she also had grandchildren at Rose Hall, and she had great-grandchildren at Rose Hall, right? So one might imagine that sort of expansion of family, creating a space that one did think about Rose Hall as home, not because of Rose Hall, but because of the other people who you were connected to by blood and not by blood, right? So I mention that too because it is important to think about the different ways that enslaved persons resisted slavery. And one was running away, though there are countless manifestations of resistance. So anytime there's, there was some celebration on my part. And also a recognition that so many acts and actions of resistance were not recorded, and especially those by enslaved women, right? And so to remind myself about that as well. But certainly, yes, the whole spectrum of emotions. I'm reminded of another colleague, Marisa Fuentes, who is working on a book on what are called refuse Negroes. And refuse Negroes in the documents are African captives who made it to the Americas, right? Various parts of the Americas, including Jamaica, and were not valuable enough to be sold. So when we think of refuse, right, another word for garbage, right? And she's doing a project entirely on this. And one of the times we were at the National Archives together, and she was reading through what happened to some of these individuals, right, who were just simply thrown overboard when they arrived and weren't able to survive for very long. And certainly this was regular practice in terms of the Middle Passage, right, being African captives who were dead or who resisted being thrown overboard to die. And some also choosing to jump overboard, right, as a way to free themselves. And she came to me and she was like, I just can't. It was just on that day, too much to read about what had happened to them and the ways that those persons had been treated. Right. And so, in tears as a result of that. Right. And then having to still do a project because no one has worked on it. Right. So the importance of still writing it, and she's still working on the book, but knowing that this is as much an intellectual endeavor as it is an emotional journey, And so I experienced my own emotional journey in terms of this book, too.
All right, the last question that we're going to take is another question from our online platform. Don't worry, persons here. You will have one more question here. Okay, so we're taking our last two questions. Persons here, you'll have the opportunity to talk with Professor because she will also be signing books. So for persons who have their copy and they didn't get it signed, now's your chance. For persons who don't have their copy, now's your chance to get it and also get it signed. And I believe it is discounted today as well. So a lot of whopping things going on. A lot of whopping things going on here. So the online question came from Howard. He says, should the truth of this book make its way into a reworking or at least a deepening of how the history of slavery is taught in Jamaican schools?
So is this Howard Armstrong?
Very
You see how the Armstrongs are prominent in the whole thing. Thank you for your question, Mr. Armstrong. And yes, I mean, I think that would be wonderful. Absolutely. And would be happy to assist in any way. And, whether it's in, at UE or even before that, right, in terms of just secondary schools, et cetera. One of the reasons, actually, and I didn't mention this, and I don't think I actually mentioned it in the book either. One of the reasons why I really wanted to write this, too, is that for the tours, there are groups of school children who go through the tours, right, on a regular basis as part of learning the history of Jamaica and the history of slavery. And certainly on the tours, people were excited that they were learning about the history of slavery and Annie Palmer. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write it, right, was that we should give our children the truth, right? I mean, adults too. And certainly, right? And that what are they coming away with, right? After the tour about slavery, about enslaved persons, about themselves, right? So yes, Mr. Armstrong, absolutely. I agree with you. And I hope to help in some way with that, for sure.
I definitely want to connect you with Dr. Isis Semaj that is in the house. She's very instrumental in the literatures in English department in the humanities up at the University of the West Indies. So after, we will connect you both to see really how we can probably put something in place in the curriculum, a module or something. It's definitely important that we not just leave the information that we have in this book, but really get it into the schools so we can get to the root of change. And the final question is here in the house, and it's coming from Karen. Another Armstrong.
I love it.
Armstrong, definitely. Yes. Thank you. And hello, wherever you are, Mr. Armstrong, somewhere in the world. This has been amazing for me. And my thing is, I'm a musician, and as I listened, what came to me was like a sweet, creating a musical, like a sweet, but listening to everything. But there's so much more. There's so much more. And this question is to both of you, because my thing is, do people still read? Are people reading? Because I know, Richard, I know, David, I know you read. But, yes, but you have to read. But what I'm saying is this little, I'm sure you feel it, persons who are here, we've gotten so much out of this. And all of this is coming from a book. But are young people, older people, taking up books? I know you have audio books and all of these things, but sometimes I find myself in groups and we sit down and we have conversations about these things. But I don't know. I think, and in listening to these conversations, it seems to me that a lot of people still feel enslaved. A lot of people feel enslaved, and this is holding them back. And a lot of this is happening, but people are not expressing. It's almost acting, and so I'm saying this is such a wonderful experience here. But I'm wondering, are people connecting if they're not reading? So how, to the book fairy, how do we get persons, because I don't know if book reading is probably a thing of the past. So you probably have, audiobooks. I think you were saying yesterday you don't like to read some audiobooks, or they're not as effective. For me, for me, when I read a book like this, I want to have it with my marker to, make notes and this type of thing, and, and then have a conversation. But I'm saying all of what I've heard here goes deeper, because there are a lot of people. We're talking about what happened, all the names of, and it's powerful. But today in 2022, there are many who are feeling this same kind of thing. And I think that this kind of setting needs to happen much more. We need to be having these regularly, so persons can begin to express what is really inside, and get some hurts dealt with, and some, and this, for you, Book Fairy, because I know you have your thing on Friday nights and so forth, probably can, find ways to encourage persons again to read, use this experience here, because I'm looking at everybody, I see everybody has been very engaged, and probably thinking, and so I want to for this to go further. So it is not necessarily a question, but a comment saying that, this kind of thing is something we need to be doing much more often, so that we can express what we're feeling, and we can hear from persons who have done in-depth study, as Celia has done remarkable study. And as Celia spoke, I don't know if you were watching her, but there were emotions coming out of her. I was just waiting for her to get a tissue and whatever. But clearly, somebody who would have to go through this, it must have been very, very, very emotional for her. And as I listened to her, I felt with it, and I said, but hold on, Karen, you're going to need to check yourself, about how you are really feeling, So it's a comment, and I'm encouraging us to, Celia will be writing about 10 more books, and we can meet back here. we can meet back here next, but Book Fairy, think about it, because if we can do more, not just online and stuff, but bring it to, because I believe that Jamaicans are hurting. When you just mentioned things like monarchy and this and the depth of, whatever. But do we really know how it really goes? Kind of a thing. My 2 cents.
Yes, very solid point. I just want to make a quick point as the book fairy. One of the reasons why I became the book fairy is not only because reading has been something that I've been doing for as long as I have been able to. My aunt is here. She can attest to the fact that I would read anything. I mean, absolutely anything. A piece of newspaper on the ground, I am going to read it. But during COVID, I created my Instagram. We call it Bookstagram because that's the book space on Instagram. I created my Bookstagram page also because I felt as if the context in which reading is viewed in Jamaica is very specific to scholastic measure. So it's all about academia. We are reading for a specific purpose. I am reading this novel only because it is a literature textbook and I am going to be graded on it. I am reading this history book because I am doing CXC history and I am going to be graded on it. But we aren't necessarily absorbing the information. We are swatting the information for a specific purpose in that specific moment. And once that specific moment has passed, the information is discarded or pushed back because it has no relevance. So when I created my Bookstagram page, though I focus very heavily on fiction, which I want people not to demark fiction as if it is not of substance and value. There are a lot of life lessons to be learned in fiction. But I created that page because my aim as the book fairy, and that's also the reason why I created the foundation. Well, I am in the process of creating the official foundation, but created this foundation for young boys goes back to what you said about what we were talking about, legacy and lineage and identity, and just how the black male has always been somewhat disenfranchised. And that's why I felt it so important to have that ability to reach out to young boys. So what I do is I get books from fellow friends. Even Trisha, who asked the question earlier, she has sent me books to give out, and I supply like books to the various boys' homes so that they can read for that therapeutic reason, reading not for school. And I think if we can change the dynamic in Jamaica and change that culture, people will start reading and healing, because people will start reading for that purpose and not for scholastic purposes. If we can have that shift, then I think that is when people will take up a book like Unsilencing Slavery. You mentioned Vereen Shepherd. I've read so many of her books, not in a textual way, but just for that knowledge. If we can change that, then we can actually see freedom in our people, because as you rightfully said, there's a difference between the emancipation where we are legally free, but many of us are not free. Many of us are not even aware of our true identity. And I'm going to mention the monarchy. The death of the Queen and the responses of persons to the death of the Queen is a key indicator that many of us do not understand ourselves and our identity and our makeup and our ancestry. So you made a very solid point. I'm going to say Karen now because we're on, Karen. But I agree with you 100%. And as you rightfully said, everybody here does seem so engaged, and we are all learning so much from this book. And we salute you once again, Professor Naylor, for taking up that baton, taking up that task, making yourself completely vulnerable in this piece of work to share that with us, and we receive it. So
let me thank you. I know we want persons to leave and be free outside too, but I have to say I'm going to try to keep it to two things. And one is one of the things that has I mean, to your point, Karen, one of the things that we don't necessarily tap into is the joy and love of reading, right? And also of writing, right? Not because I have this essay that I have to do that's 5 pages that's due, next week, or this paper or an exam or whatever, that I'm reading for the purpose of that, right? As you were saying, Shanique, but just the absolute joy of it, right? The love of it. And for writing too, right? In a journal, or a thought, or a quote that comes to mind, or a feeling, or anything, right? And I would also remind you that enslaved persons, part of the tenets of slavery is that they were forbidden, right, from learning to read and write. So if for no other reason, right, pick up a book, pick up a pen, because so many of our ancestors, right, were forbidden from doing that. Some still learned, right, that act of resistance, learning how to read and write, but not all did. Right. And also, even in the present day, I would also say, just as there's a difference between emancipation and freedom, there's a difference between independence and freedom, too. Right. And so how do we imagine Jamaican independence? How do we imagine our own individual independence as well as a national independence? And how do we still speak to and experience levels and dimensions of mental slavery, right, when we are absolutely free human beings, right? So what does it mean in the present day to still be enslaved by a school system, right, that doesn't provide the kind of education that it should to every single child, right? What does it mean for not every single person to have potable water, not to be able to have food to eat, right, that is nourishing to their bodies? What is it like for them to be hearing things about themselves and the people around them that are negative, that are deleterious to their sense of themselves? All of those things limit us, limit the capaciousness of our human experiences, right? And so to think about all the quotidian, the daily ways that we imprison ourselves, but also the ways that we extend that imprisonment to others, and to turn that around, right? So to remind ourselves of the past, but then also to think about the present and moving forward into a future of actual freedom. And what does that really mean in 2022, right?
Wow, we want to thank everyone for coming. I knew that we were going to have a discussion that was going to be, I don't want to say delightful because it's not a delightful topic, but I knew we were going to have a conversation that was going to be thought-provoking and that was going to really have us thinking and really have us processing. But I had no idea that we were going to be unable to free ourselves of this conversation, because everybody here is planted. I see nobody looking restless. Everybody's comfortable, like, yeah, actually in the next hour I could still be talking about this right here. But unfortunately there is a tropical storm, and so in the next hour everyone needs to be making their way home to safety. So I'm going to take this opportunity to wrap up. We are going to allow Professor Naylor to say her last words today, because today is not her last day. She's saying her last words of this session. And I want to thank you for allowing me to moderate for this exceptional body of work. It is an honor to be, I told you earlier, it's an honor to be in your presence, but it is an honor to be in the presence of greatness. And this is not for the weak of heart, and a job like this is not for it is for the chosen. And you might think that you chose this, but you were chosen by God to bring this out. You were chosen. You were put on this path. You were given this task by a higher power, by the Almighty. And we are thankful that you answered the call and that you brought it to fruition in such a carefully put together, thoughtful, accurate, appropriate way. So congratulations again on your 5 to 6 years of hard work. Congratulations on taking the public transportation. We salute you on taking the public transportation to Spanish Town and back, and all the hard work that you had to put in to ensure that everyone who gets a copy of this book is enriched and is made aware, renewed in their thought, and is now exposed to the truth, which is what we need to be able to heal as individuals, the truth. So thank you so much for making the journey here to have this book launch with us here, the first of I know a series of book launches that you will be doing of this book. And I want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and I'm going to give you the mic now so that you can say your gratitude. And then, guys, as I said before, if you have a copy of the book, Professor Naylor will be available to sign. You can also purchase a copy of the book here today, and it is discounted, so today is the day. But also you can purchase another day too. Please purchase for friends and family. Perfect for gifts. Christmas is around the corner. Before you know it, look, here's a gift option. Okay, and over to you, Professor Naylor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shanique. My last words are really just gratitude and appreciation. Shanique, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. You have many other things to be doing with your life as the book fairy and other aspects. So thank you so much. Thanks to Karen for, again, the choreographer of the whole thing, and for the arrangement, and Michelle, the wonderful vocalist. Thanks to the duo of the two of you. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Bookophilia, of course, and David Pierce over there, who has been a champion of the book in many ways and different pieces of this. Oh, goodness. And to David Thomas, who is not here in the room, but also part of Bookophilia, to the Axiom team also that was live streaming this for us. So I appreciate that as well. And to all of you, thank you for coming out. There's a tropical storm outside, and still you came. So I really appreciate that. Armstrong, and you don't have to be a member of the Armstrong family to have been here, but thanks to the Armstrong family. And Chris, Howard, wherever you are in Canada. Yes, to everybody who's logged in, thank you so much for taking time out to do that, especially when there were many other things for you to do. So, but thanks for Howard for coordinating the Cool 97 FM and other parts of it. So thank you so much. Really a pleasure to have you here. And I hope some piece of it spoke to your heart. So thanks so much.
So thank you everyone again for coming. At this point, as Shanique mentioned, if you get out your books, and you can get them signed, or you can, I think you have some books here. You can, peruse and have a look at them, etc. While you're doing so, Celia has been very gracious and very kind to have provided some snacks for us all. So you can go and partake at this time. And while you're doing so, feel free to meet and greet, meet the author, meet the book fairy, and just enjoy yourselves. All right? I think I can wrap up here then. So, good. Have a good night, everyone, and get home safely.